wine and spirits analyst, which just sounds like an excuse to drink and tell people what you're drinking. But anyway.
Oh, it was.
I'm sure it was more than that. We also have Sophie Ibbotson, who's the Uzbekistan ambassador for tourism, and also the World Bank's tourism consultant for Tajikistan, as well as a multi-published travel writer and photographer. She's also been the author of 5 travel guides in the Brad series, and also the updater in several insight guides. So a lot of writing and photography done by Sophie. So without further ado, I'll hand over now to Sophie, who will present on Central Asia.
Thank you very much, Will. I'm just going to try and share my screen with you, and then hopefully you'll be able to see my pictures as well.
Yes.
So I should be able to make this full size. 1 second. There we go. Hopefully now you can see it full size. So I decided to call this talk Central Asia an Accidental Obsession because I visited Central Asia for the first time in 2008, and it was supposed to be just a trip like any other. But what has happened in the intervening years is that it's turned from being just one trip to, well, 12 years down the line, I'm still working in Central Asia. I've been living there, I've been studying it, and it's completely taken over my life. So beware where you go on holiday. You might find it changes things completely. It was very much accidental. Before I went to Central Asia, I considered myself to be a South Asia specialist. I come from a family who'd spent 5 generations living and working in South Asia. I studied Hindi and Urdu at university. I had studied in India, I was working there, and I was thinking, okay, this is my life, this is where I want to be. And then in 2008, I decided I was going to drive home from India by auto rickshaw, which is, hang on, it's not letting me here, there we go. By auto rickshaw, I decided this was the best way to get back from India to London rather than flying. And as any of you who've done sort of big overlanding trips will know, between the subcontinent and Europe, you can either take the southern route, which will take you through Pakistan, Iran and Turkey, or you can go over the northern part, over the northern side of Afghanistan and go through Central Asia. And for whatever reason, I decided I would take the northern route, probably because Baluchistan was looking a bit sketchy at the time. So I, with a couple of friends and a couple of auto rickshaws, decided that I would drive the long way home and go back through Central Asia. And as it happened, this was the view on my first day in Kyrgyzstan, having come over the Toragat Pass from China. It was 25 degrees below freezing. And as you can see from the roads, rather a lot of snow and pack ice. And the winter had come a little early in 2008. And so whereas I had assumed I would be able to drive straight through Kyrgyzstan out the other side and keep going, the weather had very, very different ideas. Auto rickshaws with 3 very, very small wheels do not like ice. On our sort of second day in Kyrgyzstan, we managed to more or less write off one of the auto rickshaws and thought, actually, this is not a good idea to keep driving. We're going to have to stop, hole up, wait for some better weather, and then continue the journey in the spring. So I stopped in Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan, and thought I would spend a few days there looking around, getting to know the place a little bit. And as luck would have it, the national newspaper got hold of these sort of crazy foreigners who were driving auto rickshaws through Kyrgyzstan in the winter, and they put us on the front page of the national newspaper as this sort of crazy story. And various people saw that story in Bishkek, and one of them was the permanent secretary to the tourism ministry, and turned up at our hotel basically saying, what on earth are you doing? But I think it's a lovely idea. Do you want to come and have a chat about promoting Kyrgyzstan? So I was staying at the Hyatt there for a few days, and got offered a job by the tourism ministry to see if I wanted to stay with my colleague in Kyrgyzstan. And as many of you will remember, 2008 was when the financial crash happened. I was a fairly new graduate at that point, and the thought of actually coming back to London and looking for a proper job really didn't have any appeal. There was no guaranteed reason I would get one when I came back. So the idea of staying in Kyrgyzstan and working there had a lot of appeal, although I knew nothing about the country, didn't speak any of the languages, and had originally thought I was going to be there for 4 or 5 days and that was it. But I was very, very lucky. I got to stay in Kyrgyzstan for the best part of 4 years. And I used that as a base to start exploring not only the whole of Kyrgyzstan, but also the neighbouring countries. I got asked by Brat travel guides, who I've worked with a lot in the subsequent years, to update their Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan guidebooks. And they then commissioned me to write books on Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. So it was a fantastic opportunity whilst I was living and working out there to travel to all sorts of small and crazy corners of countries that I knew very little about, and also it seemed at the time most other people in the UK knew very little about as well. Central Asia today, all of the countries are much, much more open than they were 10, 12 years ago. It's much easier to get there in terms of flights. The visa requirements are much lower. So we are now seeing far more tourists come through and opening up the region bit by bit. But then when I first went out, I mean, there were days when I felt I was sort of gone back in time or gone to this sort of complete wild place, and I didn't know quite what to expect. My talk today is not going to be country by country, but it's going to be more thematic. And the reason is for that, because I wanted to draw in lots of different places from all across Central Asia, and particularly focus on the smaller destinations and the experiences that you might not have heard of before. In the last few years, the tourism ministries and myself and my colleagues and all of the journalists who have been coming out to Central Asia have been doing a really, really good job of pushing the big name sites in Central Asia. I mean, particularly in Uzbekistan, places like Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva are becoming not quite household names, but certainly people are much more familiar with them. So I wanted to show you some of the less familiar places and show you that you can still have a quirky, weird and wonderful adventure with very, very few, if any, other tourists there as well. I've put the names of the places on the bottoms of the slides just in case you want to go and visit them afterwards, but also to help you remember in case you've got any questions. The first thing that I'm really going to talk to you about is the history and the archaeological sites, because it's something that really, really interests me personally, but also I think whenever you visit a country or visit a region, you do need to understand the past. The nation states that we have today, in the case of the Central Asian republics, were only created in 1991. So as countries, they are considerably younger than I am. And therefore we need to look further back in time to the shared history and to the empires and the cultures that created them, because actually the modern borders are very recent and quite artificial. Some of the earliest sites across Central Asia are the petroglyph sites, so rock carvings dating back to, in some cases, the Neolithic period. This site here is Samishsai, which is in the Navoy region in sort of north-central Uzbekistan. They reckon there were about 10,000 petroglyphs at this single site. There are other sites nearby, but this particular site has got about 10,000 drawings dating back. The earliest ones are from the Neolithic period. And the really cool thing about this site, as far as I'm concerned, is the kind of animals that you can see. So you can see in this particular picture, there is something which is either mammoth or elephant-like with huge, great tusks. There were also petroglyphs of lions, of tigers, of wild cattle. And actually none of those creatures are still wild in that part of Uzbekistan because of the climate change that's happened in the intervening millennia, but also because of the hunting. So not only do we know historically that the environment would have been very, very different, but we can also use these petroglyphs to, or the type of animal that's in the petroglyphs to date the paintings themselves, because the paleontologists know from the fossil finds which species were here. And then we can marry them up with the art and say, okay, if ancient rock artist number 24 has painted this kind of animal or carved this kind of animal into the rock, it must be that the artwork was made before X date, because after that we know that the animal was extinct in this area. So it's a really cool historical record of the wildlife and the natural environment, as well as being a really creative piece of artwork. There's another site here. This is my colleague Steph, but this is at Langar, down in the Wakhan corridor between Afghanistan and Tajikistan. And in the bottom left of the screen, you can see the ibex with their curly horns. And there are still ibex in Tajikistan today, and they have quite a ritual importance, culturally speaking, particularly the sort of pre-Islamic traditions, some of which still survive. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about those later on. Moving, I was going to say moving slightly forward in time. Actually, we're probably jumping several thousand years, because the oldest of those petroglyphs are 8,000 years old. But I'm going to skip you through. So we're still in BC, but we're talking first millennium BC now. There are a huge number of archaeological sites all across Central Asia, because something that we have to remember is that even prior to the Silk Road as we know it, this was centers of civilizations. And although in many places the sand or the steppe or the mud has reclaimed cities, these were some of the biggest and most sophisticated and wealthy settlements on the planet. And they put to shame anything that we had in Europe or in the Americas at the time. Very, very sophisticated communities. This particular site that you see here is called Kampia Tepe, and it's close to Temiz in the southern part of Afghanistan, southern part of Uzbekistan. And the plain that you see beyond the site is really the floodplain of the Amudarya River, which is the natural border between Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. And when the city was built, it would have been actually on the river. It would have been a river port. It was built by Alexander the Great, and we think that it is the city that Ptolemy refers to as Alexandria on the Oxus. They only realized last year that it was likely to be that site. And one of the main reasons for it is Ptolemy talked about it being a port on the river. And given that the river had moved, this city didn't appear to match up to the descriptions. But the more the archaeologists have dug, they've started to find the port, the harbour, and have realised actually it is, or it does appear to be, the city described by Ptolemy. It's just that in the 2,500 years since it was built, the river has changed its course, and therefore the landscape looks quite different to how it would have been. One of the really cool things about this site, and another reason that we think it is an Alexandria, because Alexander the Great built a lot of Alexandrias, is that some of the features within the city seem to be carbon copies of ones that are in other cities that Alexander built or that he conquered. So the fortress gates at Kampia Tepe, for example, are an exact copy of one which is in Turkey. And that means that there must have been a connection between the two cities. It wasn't just built by accident. It was designed in a very, very particular way, the layout, the dimensions. So there was a link with that. There was a temple of Apollo here. Some of the coins that have been found, again, date it to Alexander the Great's period. I picked this picture because it reminds me very much of Machu Picchu, and obviously we've been talking about Peru. This is Castle Charon in Tajikistan, which is another lost city, if you like. The archaeologists only really started working here in 2012. And what they have found is a 100-hectare site, the earliest parts of which date from the 2nd millennium BC. And it's high up above the river in Tajikistan, looking down onto what is now Afghanistan, but clearly would have been a trade route through. This must have been a position that people wanted to defend, and indeed it's at the sort of looking down on two valleys and the river, so a good position. Some of the really cool features of the site is there is a Zoroastrian water temple here, which suggests it was linked to a river deity. And there was a stadium, a polo stadium, that would have been big enough to accommodate 10,000 spectators at the same time. So if we're thinking about the scale of the settlement and indeed its importance in the region, this was a city big enough to justify 10,000 people coming to watch the polo all in one go. And it's hard to believe these days when you look at the city and you can't see a sign of modern human habitation, that actually there must have been a very big sophisticated settlement here in order to justify building it. There is also a fire temple on the site that's built in a sort of a ziggurat style shape. They've been discovering astrolabes, which suggests that the people had some sort of understanding of astronomy and plotting the stars. So another very, very cool place. Castle Charon has a sort of a Zoroastrian link to it. Fires Tepe, which is again close to Temiz, not far from Kampir Tepe, was an important Buddhist site in southern Uzbekistan. And what we have to remember is that the Silk Road was a conduit not only for people and goods, but also for ideas. And Buddhism would have spread from India up through the sort of Karakoram and across Afghanistan to what is now southern Uzbekistan. And it became quite a hub for religious learning and for religious art. So the sculptures and the artworks that have been excavated from Fires Tepe and are now in the museum in Temiz have, on one hand, very strong Buddhist influence, and there are some artistic influences from the Indian subcontinent, but equally because this was territory that was controlled by Alexander the Great and became part of the Greco-Bactrian Empire, you've also got the Greek influences as well. So it's a really fascinating melting pot of cultures. This site is the Toprakala, which is in the western part of Uzbekistan, and was part, or is part of what is called the Golden Ring of Khwarezm. There are nearly, well, I think so far they have discovered 52 fortresses in this particular area, which is close to the Turkmen border. There are probably more under the sand, but whether we will find them or not, we don't know. But certainly more than 50 have been discovered so far. Some of them, like Toprakala, are very, very large, others are smaller. But it's, for me, very, very interesting because the concentration of fortresses in this particular area means that it must have been the frontier land. It's a bit like thinking about the Scottish borders in the UK. There's a reason that so many forts were built so close to each other. And that's because there was an anticipation of wave after wave of attack. And every time you lost a fortress, you had to sort of retreat to the next one. Or if you were having a good war, obviously you can push your frontier further and have another fortress. So this is a fascinating part of Uzbekistan because of the concentration of archaeological sites. And if you do go to Khiva, which obviously is one of the famous UNESCO World Heritage Sites, you can get on a day trip out to the Khwarezm fortresses because they're pretty close by. One of the things that I'm really, really interested in is having sort of, I've mentioned to you a little bit about the sort of the Zoroastrian practices and the Buddhist heritage there as well, is that a lot of the ideas of Buddhism and Zoroastrianism and also shamanism and the sort of the pagan ideas survived the arrival of Islam in Central Asia. We tend to think that Islam is something sort of a monolithic religion, and that it's going to be the same in Uzbekistan as it is in Saudi Arabia, as it is in Pakistan. But actually, Central Asian Islam, even today, is quite different in part it's because it has incorporated a lot of the pre-Islamic traditions as well. And you do find that a lot of the practices that are considered very normal in Central Asia are actually not accepted by the orthodoxy in the Middle East. They seem to think that the Central Asian Muslims are heretics because of the things that they do. But actually, as far as I can see, it's actually a continuation of cultural practices and a fusion that they have developed the religion in their own way. You do still often see, in this particular picture, you can see the prayer flags. You often will see a tail of an animal, for example. And if you go into Timur's tomb in Samarkand, you will see there's a tail hanging up inside, which is a sort of a nod to his Mongol heritage. You will often see ibex horns or Marco Polo sheep horns. And these are sort of almost talismans for protection. But you will also see the flags and the ribbons. And you'll see these even around Muslim pilgrimage sites. And often they are people's prayers, that they have tied a ribbon, for example, to a tree or next to a holy spring. And the hope is that by the time that the ribbon has sort of fallen off, that their prayer will have come true. This picture is taken in the Bibi Khanum Mosque in Samarkand, which when it was built, I think was the biggest mosque in the world, or certainly one of the biggest and one of the most important. And this stand was built to hold the Quran. And one of the really, really interesting things about it, as far as I'm concerned, is even today, if women can't have children, they will go to the Bibi Khanum Mosque and they will climb underneath the Quran stand through the gaps between the legs, and that they believe that by doing so, that their prayers will be heard and they will have children. And I have obviously not experienced that myself. I don't have any children yet. But I have been in there and I've spoken to guides who have sworn absolutely blind that they have brought people to the Bibi Khanum Mosque who had no luck getting pregnant at all. They've had injections, they've had IVF, they've gone through everything. And then as a last resort, almost as a sort of, oh, well, it can't hurt sort of thing, have climbed underneath the Quran stand and then 9 months later had a baby. So whether it actually has miraculous powers, we don't know, but certainly people believe still very strongly that it is good for fertility. And there's a similar site in Bukhara. There's a sacred tree within the complex of Bahadur Naqshbandi, which again, people believe that if you have got fertility problems or you've got health problems, that you should go to this particular tree, that you should climb underneath it, and that God then will heal you. Those kind of ideas are very, very unacceptable to the orthodoxy. They get very, very upset. One of the sites which is similarly controversial is the mausoleum of Ahmed Hoja Yasawi in Turkestan in southern Kazakhstan. And a lot of Central Asian Muslims will tell you that if you go on pilgrimage 3 times to Turkestan, that is as good as going on Hajj. That you don't need to bother going to Mecca, because Turkestan, if you do 3 trips, it's holy enough. I did have, when I worked in Kyrgyzstan, a colleague from Egypt who was told this by the Kyrgyz Muslims we were working with, and our Egyptian friend was absolutely mortified that this local pilgrimage site could in any way be conceived to replace Mecca as a pilgrimage destination. But local people have got their own beliefs, their own interests, and in purely practical terms, it's an awful lot easier and cheaper to get to Turkestan than it is to get to Saudi Arabia. These are some of the ladies at the Naqshbandi shrine in Bukhara, which I mentioned briefly. And one of the things that I'm really interested in, there's probably a phrase that you'll hear me say quite a lot, because this talk is basically about what I'm interested in, regardless of what you guys want to hear about. But one of the things that I have got quite interested in is the relationship between pilgrimage and tourism. And one of the things that we're finding, particularly in Uzbekistan, but to some extent in the other countries in Central Asia now, is the rise in domestic tourism is very closely linked to pilgrimage. And it's quite interesting to see, particularly older ladies now who probably are living a little bit longer, have got a little bit more disposable income, and they are taking the opportunity in their retirement to travel within their own country or to travel to neighbouring countries to go to pilgrimage sites. And so quite often when you go to the shrines in Uzbekistan or to the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, you will see groups of older ladies travelling together. Often they've come by bus, and they are taking the opportunity to explore and get to know their country. And I think this is absolutely brilliant. This is a picture of my friend Kelly in Samarkand with another group of the ladies that we met. I think they wanted to adopt Kelly. They weren't so keen on me, but Kelly they wanted. But it's fantastic that in some cases for the first time, people have got the time, money and opportunity to travel within their own countries. It's very safe for them to do so. And they can appreciate their cultural heritage as well. It's not tourism for outsiders, it is tourism for local people as well. I mentioned the overlap between pilgrimage and tourism, but the other comparison I want to make between those two things is that often with pilgrimage, the journey is as important as the destination. And if you think, for example, about the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, the Camino, actually, yes, people want to get to Santiago de Compostela, but the journey and the sense of preparation and the physical effort that you have to make and the mental preparedness is actually a very, very important part of the journey as well. And I think that's a big case whenever you're traveling within Central Asia. It's not like jumping on a plane and going to Paris for the weekend or going to Rome for the weekend. The journey is always a really, really important part of the adventure. And it's part of it is the drama of the landscapes, because the scale of the landscapes is extraordinary and many, many times bigger than anything I think we have in Europe. It's also about the people that we meet along the way, and of course the accidents and the incidents and all of the things that happen to you, which often are unplanned but give you a laugh later on. This picture was taken in 2010, and it was the first time I was in Tajikistan. I seem to have a thing for long distance road trips, because this particular car I decided to drive out from the UK to Afghanistan, and we got very, very stuck in the mud and the river just off the Pamir highway. There had been a mudslide and it had taken out a hunk of the road, so all the cars were going down into the riverbed instead. And in theory, this was a 4x4 vehicle, but it wasn't 4x4 in any proper sense. So we got very, very stuck in the mud and had to be rescued by the Tajik army, who thankfully pushed us out and did their good deed. And sort of probably about 20 minutes later, we came across them again, and this time they had got stuck. So at least we were able to return the favour and dig them out of the mud. The best thing for me, other than the landscapes, is the people you meet in these places in between, because they are not the experiences you plan for, they're not the destinations which you are working towards, but some of the most memorable things are the places in between and the people in between. This picture is one of my favourites, I think, that has ever been taken of me. And it's in a very small village called Nicham in northern Afghanistan. And we had stopped there en route from Ishkashim to Baharak in Badakhshan. And just the people we met and the warmth, the sense of fun and the sense of surprise. This was my first trip to Afghanistan, and I don't know really what I expected, but I certainly didn't expect to be met by a gaggle of girls who were out and about and having so much fun and wanting to interact with foreigners. So that, I think that day was the highlight of my trip, and it certainly wasn't something that I would have planned into the schedule, because I had no idea that it was going to happen. I've got a sort of a few other pictures now of places in between, which in some cases you may consider a destination, but equally are other places that you might see on a drive all the way through. Yamchun Fortress in the Wakhan Corridor is, I think, one of the most dramatic ruins anywhere in Central Asia, and it's the positioning. It's not that there is that much left of the fort. It's not that it is one of the most historically significant structures, but it's that location. And you can see why it would have been built there. You can see both ways along the Wakhan Corridor. But it's just a sort of a magical looking fortress. Another similar place that I found very, very curious was Aralsk in Kazakhstan. And this, a bit like Moynak in Uzbekistan, used to be a fishing port on the Aral Sea before the Aral Sea shrunk. Would I recommend going to Aralsk as your number one stop in Kazakhstan? Absolutely no way. They have the worst hotel and worst restaurants I think I've ever eaten in Central Asia. But it's fascinating to see how the fortunes of a place have changed so quickly, because in the 1960s, this was still a flourishing port with big canneries. There's mosaics in the railway station sort of celebrating when the fish of Aralsk saved the Soviet Union from starvation. I mean, it was a big producer of fish and very well connected, and now it's the absolute back of beyond. But a curious place, an interesting sort of environmental story, and then a lot of people want to go and see the ships in the desert as well. Penultimate image from me: if you ever get the opportunity to see Bushkashi or its variants in Central Asia, absolutely go for it. In Kyrgyzstan, it's called kokburu, but it's more or less the same sport, and you are reasonably likely to see it in towns on major holidays. So Nowruz, the Persian New Year, which is the spring equinox, is always a good opportunity to see Bushkashi. But there are other public holidays as well. And it may be that it's played in a village, it may be that it's played in a town in a stadium, but it is an event which has developed over centuries, really. It has grown out of the cavalry, out of raiding your neighbour's village to steal their goats, and probably riding off with their daughters and girlfriends as well. But it's not put on as it's a tourist sport. It's very much for the local people, and it's still a very authentic experience. So if you do get the chance to see it, you'll be surrounded by local people. Health and safety goes out the window, so be prepared to run quickly if the horses come towards you. Obviously, I was completely disregarding any health and safety when this picture was taken, because I'm sat in the middle of the goal and the horses are racing at me. I was told that they were very well trained and they would split at the last minute rather than trampling me, and thankfully that was true, but I don't think I had the insurance if it wasn't. And the last shot, for sort of places in between and the unexpected things that you find in Central Asia is Amisoy, which is the new ski resort that's been built in Uzbekistan. There is actually fantastic skiing in Kazakhstan as well. If you're into backcountry skiing, there's some good skiing in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. They just don't have the infrastructure. But I put this here because people think about Central Asia and about the history and about the culture, and possibly to do with the nature as well. But what people don't expect to see is the extreme sports and the adventure sports, and that is something which I think the region is just starting to develop now, and is going to be quite a exciting additional tourism product to see develop in the next few years. So yeah, that was my, oh, there's me. Yeah, so I think that is a very fast run through some of my favourite places in Central Asia with no particular coordination to them, but hopefully I've shown you a few places that you haven't seen before.
Thanks, Sophie. Can you unshare?
Yes.
Okay.
There we go.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks very much, Sophie. Absolutely fascinating, really beautiful places in the back of nowhere, a lot of them, but as you say, it's often the things you're not planning to see along the journey that actually are the highlights. They're totally unexpected. Okay, and so as we did previously, if anyone would like to ask a question of Sophie, and indeed Jonathan, if you want to answer any questions as well, if you could just go to your wave button and give us a little wave, I'll unmute you. So, no questions?
Matt is waving.
Oh, yeah, Matt's waving. Hi, Matt, fire away.
Hi, right, good stuff. So, Sophie, from the work that you've done with tourism authorities in Uzbekistan, in addition to your classic Silk Road cities like Samarkand and Khiva, is there anywhere that you think they'll really start pushing over the next few years? Anywhere they're really keen for tourists to discover and explore beyond the Silk Road cities?
The next big product, not just for Uzbekistan, but for all destinations, has to be ecotourism and adventure tourism. And it was starting to happen anyway, pre-COVID, because more and more people are interested in responsible tourism, in community experiences, and they don't want the sort of over-tourism crowded experience. So Uzbekistan had already started to develop ecotourism and to look at what that might look like. That process is only going to be accelerated by COVID because now we don't want to be close to anybody else. So all destinations are having to think, how can we get people outside? How can we get them into rural areas and spread them out within our country so that they're not on top of each other? Uzbekistan, the areas which I think are particularly interesting for ecotourism and sort of adventure tourism, one is Navoy, which is where the petroglyphs are. They already have got the Nurata Kizilkum Biosphere Reserve. So that's got some quite interesting hiking, mountains, smallish mountains, desert and man-made lakes, but some interesting hiking trails. And they've developed a network in the Sentob Valley of homestays and guest houses for community-based tourism. So that's really, really good. Tashkent region, which is actually where the ski resort is. Oh, in fact, there's 3 ski resorts there, but Amasoy is the best developed one. The idea is that will become a year-round adventure destination because they've got big mountains there. So anybody who wants to do climbing, hiking, mountain biking, swimming in lakes, camping, all of those sorts of things can be done really, really easily in Tashkent region. And then there are a number of national parks which are being opened up to tourism because previously there were a number of national parks, particularly those which were in border areas, which were national parks insofar as they were protected areas, but you weren't allowed into them without a permit, which somewhat limited their tourism potential. But now the government has started removing the permit requirements, so those natural areas can be developed for ecotourism and for hiking and for wildlife as well. I wouldn't say that you go to Uzbekistan specifically for the wildlife. I wouldn't say you go to any of the Central Asian countries specifically for the wildlife. However, if you are interested in hiking and nature generally, and landscape, and you're prepared to spend time outdoors, there is wildlife there, but it's not the sort of Botswanan style sort of safari experience where you can drive through and you're guaranteed to see big game. You do need a little bit more patience and to go a little bit further afield. But there's ibex, there are Marco Polo sheep, there are wolves, there are bears. So there is quite a lot of interesting wildlife there, plus a lot of bird life.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie. Sophie, I've got a question.
Hmm.
So, notwithstanding COVID,
Yeah.
how safe is Afghanistan to visit right now?
Notwithstanding COVID, it depends where you go. So I have done 3 trips into the Afghan side of the Wakhan corridor, which is always, I say always, but it is generally regarded as a safe part of Afghanistan. The Aga Khan has, over the years, spent money in developing hiking trails, building guest houses, training porters and guides. So there is some basic tourism infrastructure there. And that is an area that you can access by flying to Tajikistan. You can fly to Dushanbe and then driving down and just popping across the border. The issue comes for tourism in the rest of Afghanistan is how do you get there? Because you can fly to Kabul, but then you've got to get from Kabul to wherever those other places are. And that's where the difficulty comes, is if you've got to go large distances by road within Afghanistan. But there are pockets which are relatively tourism friendly. I mean, Bamiyan, where the Buddhas were, the Bandi Amir Lakes. I know there's a number of people who've gone to Mazar-e-Sharif and to Herat. There are pockets which have tourism potential, and the issue is the security between them and linking them up. Some of I think Wild Frontiers does a trip, and they fly between some of the destinations at the moment, but hopefully in time the security will improve, because Afghanistan's got masses of potential for all sorts of things, and tourism is one of them, because they've got spectacular landscapes, they've got a huge amount of history, they've actually got a very, very cultured and hospitable population, I would say. And one of the few good things to have come out of the occupation is actually the infrastructure is improved. So if you do go to Kabul, there are some really good hotels. There are good places to eat. The Aga Khan and various other donors have invested in the restoration of historical sites, like the Baghe Babur, so Babur's Garden, which is the burial place of the Mughal Emperor Babur. That has been completely restored and is a beautiful, beautiful place within the centre of the city. There are sort of medieval shrines and mausoleums which have been restored. There is an excellent museum which has got the Bactrian gold finds. So there is lots of tourism things in Afghanistan. It's the security which needs to be addressed for people to be able to travel there safely. And much as I love tourism, and much as I think it's a really good way of driving economic development, it isn't the priority for Afghanistan, and it shouldn't be. There are other things which need to be put in place first, and then hopefully in the future, tourism can then come in as another bit of the jigsaw puzzle.
Okay, thanks, Sophie. Anyone else got a question for Sophie?
Can I go?
Yep.
Hi, Sophie. I love what you said about the people being a big part of the story in Central Asia. I agree completely. What would you say the best things, what are the best experiences for interacting with people in Central Asia? So,
I think the best way to interact with people is doing a homestay or a yurt stay, because people are always going to be much more confident in their own environment. And they are, if you are staying with them, there is an automatic starting point for conversation. People are going to want to feed you, which is always a good thing in Central Asia. And they're going to want to talk to you about their food, and they're going to want to show you either how they're cooking, or if it's from their farm, they're going to want to take you out into the orchard, or they're going to want to show you their cow. So there are always touch points then to start that relationship with. Even if you don't share many words in common, it doesn't really matter, because there's a show and tell element. And people always have something that they're proud of, whether it is their animal or their children or their carpet, their embroidery. There'll be something which you are privileged to be able to see and to share with them. So I think that's the best way of meeting local people, is staying with people in their homes. And from a sort of a sustainable tourism and a community tourism point of view, it's also really good, because it means you're putting money directly into the local economy at definitely. A grassroots level.
Excellent. Thank you. Any other questions for Sophie? No. I've just got a quick question for Jonathan then, before we wrap up. How did you end up being a wine and spirits analyst in Central Asia?
It was a bit of nepotism, really. So a friend of mine was doing the job, and she got married and then wasn't able to travel anymore. So I was working in London for an event company, a conference company that organised conferences in Russia, in Kazakhstan, all over the kind of former Soviet Union. But I myself wasn't travelling, and I was absolutely desperate to kind of one day visit the Central Asia and Caucasus and those countries. So Sophie had a kind of an accidental obsession. I had a very deliberate obsession. I was desperate to go there one day. I finally had the chance, and yeah, the job involved every year I'd travel to sort of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and meet with companies, and that's how I got into it. So I guess to begin with, I studied Russian, so I became kind of Russian specialist, Russian translator, and then miraculously one day kind of had the opportunity to kind of make my dreams come true. That's how I got into it.
Excellent. Sounds brilliant. Okay, well, I think we'll wrap up there. So thanks everyone for joining. I will share the recording once I work out how to edit it, and I'll put it up on Twitter and on my website, and obviously everyone can share it. So hopefully we'll do another one of these in maybe a month or so's time on some different topics, and it'd be great if you could join then and spread the word as well. But thanks very much for joining today. Thanks, great, Julia and Sophie, fantastic presentations, really enjoyed it, and see you next time.
Thank you for organising it, Will.
Yeah.
Pleasure. Thanks, guys.
Speak soon. Bye.
Bye.